What really happened in the trenches they made sure you never found out.
Private Thomas Renshaw is 22 years old. He works at a textile mill in Leeds, sends half his wages home to his mother, and has never been further than 30 miles from the house where he was born. In the summer of 1914, he enlists. The poster says it will be over by Christmas. His mother presses a photograph into his coat pocket. The two of them, squinting in the sun outside their terraced house on Meanwood Road. He promises to bring it back. He won't bring it back. He won't come back at all. But that's not the part of this story that was kept from you. What was kept from you is what happened to him in the 4 years between that photograph and his death. What the army knew, what the government documented, filed, and buried. What Thomas himself could never find words for, and eventually stopped trying. Your grandfather, or someone very much like him, lived this, and almost certainly never told you why he couldn't sleep. In August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force crosses the Channel with a kind of institutional confidence that in retrospect reads as criminal negligence. Military planners estimate the war will last 6 months. They are not improvising. They genuinely believe it. The tactical doctrine of 1914 is built around mobility, cavalry charges, wars of movement. No one has seriously war-gamed what happens when both sides dig in along 400 miles of French and Belgian soil and simply refuse to move. By November, they know. By December, the Western Front is a continuous trench system stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. And the men inside it begin adjusting to a reality that no training manual has prepared them for. Thomas Renshaw arrives at the front in early 1915, assigned to a section of the Ypres Salient, the most contested, most saturated, most dangerous ground on the entire front. The salient bulges into German-held territory on 3 sides, which means artillery can reach it from almost any direction. The men call it the Ypres Salient. They say it with the flat, exhausted humor of people who have run out of real emotions. The trench he steps into is 4 feet wide and, in places, chest deep in water. This is not a temporary condition. This is the condition. The water table in Flanders sits just below the surface. Every shell crater fills within hours. The duckboards, wooden planks, laid across the trench floor, float. Men who step off them in the dark sink to their knees in mud with the consistency of wet cement. 2 men drown in the mud in Thomas's battalion before he has been there a week. Not in the fighting, in the mud. Their deaths are logged as accidental. Life above the parapet lasts approximately 7 seconds before a sniper finds you. Life below it is something else entirely. A compressed, sensory existence that the men process in silence because language fails. Here is what the documentaries don't show you. Here is what MAS*H and All Quiet and every filmed version of the Western Front leaves on the cutting room floor. The rats. Not rats as a background detail. Rats as a dominant feature of daily life. The trenches of the Western Front sustained a rat population estimated at several hundred million by 1916. They grew to the size of small cats. Documented specimens measured 18 inches from nose to tail, not including the tail. fed on the unburied dead caught in the wire between the lines. They bred in the walls of the trenches themselves. They ran across sleeping men's faces in the dark. Thomas writes home in February 1915, before the censors begin redacting more heavily. The rats here are not afraid of us. I think they understand something we don't. His mother keeps the letter. It surfaces in a family archive in 1987. The rats carry leptospirosis, Weil's disease, spread through infected urine. In the standing water, the men stand in for days at a time. It causes jaundice, kidney failure, internal hemorrhage. It kills, and it is rarely what gets listed on the death certificate. The smell. No account of the trenches omits it, and yet nothing conveys it. Cordite, which smells like fireworks and coats the throat. Rotting flesh, which the body eventually stops registering as smell and begins to experience as a kind of pressure. Human waste, because the latrines are 15 yards back down the communication trench and no one moves at night without risking a bullet. Chloride of lime, which the army spreads on the trench walls to control disease and which smells like the end of something. Men describe arriving at the front and being physically ill from the smell. Within a week, they stop noticing it. That cessation of noticing is itself a kind of damage. Trench foot, not a footnote, a medical catastrophe caused by standing in cold water for prolonged periods without removing boots, which men often cannot do because their feet swell inside them. The tissue dies. It turns black. In severe cases, it requires amputation. In 1914 and early 1915, the British Army does not issue adequate waterproof footwear because the war was not supposed to last this long. By the time regulation gumboots are distributed, 74,000 British soldiers have been treated for trench foot. The generals knew within weeks that footwear was inadequate. The procurement process took months. No one was disciplined for the delay. They traded dry land for a promise of glory, a chaplain writes in his diary in March 1915. God will account for the boots. I'm not sure the generals will. Shell shock. The army doesn't call it that at first. The first official term is neurasthenia, then disordered action of the heart. The language keeps changing because the condition keeps embarrassing the people responsible for it. What it looks like: men who cannot stop shaking, men who go blind with no physical damage to their eyes, men who lose the ability to speak or walk or control their bowels, triggered by sounds that no longer exist, men who laugh at nothing for hours, men who simply sit down and refuse to stand up again, not in defiance, but because the connection between intention and action has been severed by something no surgeon can locate. By 1917, shell shock accounts for 1 in 7 discharges from the British Army. That is not a rounding error. That is a structural collapse of the human mind under conditions the Army designed and maintained. What the Army does with these men is the part that stays classified for decades. Early in the war, shell shock is treated as cowardice. Courts-martial, firing squads. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Army executes 306 of its own soldiers for offences including desertion and cowardice. Subsequent analysis of the records, declassified incrementally through the latter half of the 20th century, indicates a significant number exhibited symptoms consistent with severe combat trauma. They were not cowards, they were broken. The army shot them at dawn and sent letters home describing them as having died in service. Their families received no pension. Their names were excluded from village war memorials. This was not a clerical oversight. It was policy. Thomas Renshaw does not get shot. What happens to Thomas is quieter and, in its way, worse. In April 1917, during the preliminary bombardment before the Battle of Arras, a shell lands close enough to Thomas's position to collapse the trench section beside him and bury 2 men alive. He digs for 3 hours with his hands before officers order the section abandoned. He never speaks about this. Not to his commanding officer, not to the regimental medical officer, not later to his wife. What his wife notices when he returns in 1919 is that he cannot tolerate closed doors, that he sleeps on the floor beside the bed rather than in it, that he flinches at thunder with a violence that frightens their children.
There is no treatment waiting for him. There is no diagnosis. There is a gratuity payment of £29 and a request that he return his gas mask. The war ends in November 1918. The silence that follows is, for many men, more disorienting than the noise. In Leeds, in Liverpool, in Glasgow and Cardiff and Birmingham, men come home to streets that have continued without them. Shops are open, children are in school. Women have been working in factories, managing finances, making decisions. The men who return are expected to step back into the shape of the lives they left, but they are different shapes now, and no one in authority is willing to say so officially. Because saying so officially would require doing something about it. The Ministry of Pensions, established to handle compensation claims, processes shell shock applications with institutional skepticism bordering on hostility. Claimants are required to prove their condition is service-related. The burden of proof sits entirely with men who can barely articulate what is wrong with them. Between 1919 and 1939, the ministry systematically reduces or revokes pension awards through a process of periodic reassessment. Veterans are called in for review. Doctors employed by the ministry, not independent physicians, determine whether symptoms have improved. Pensions are downgraded, some are canceled entirely. By 1929, roughly 65,000 veterans are receiving disability pensions related to neurasthenia and shell shock. By 1939, that number has been administratively reduced to fewer than 40,000, not because men recovered, but because the ministry reclassified them. The files documenting the reassessment criteria remain restricted until the 1980s. No minister responsible for this policy is ever named in a public inquiry. No inquiry is ever called. The men's families absorb the consequences. Wives who had hoped for husbands receive men they don't recognize and are given no framework to understand why. Children grow up learning which sounds not to make, which topics not to raise, which doors to leave open. They learn to read the silences as a kind of weather, to know when a storm is coming, and to make themselves small until it passes. This is the inheritance that never appears in the official histories, not the medals, not the silence, the particular shape of a family organized around damage that no one will name. Courage, one veterans advocate wrote to the ministry in 1923, was apparently free. It was the wreckage they couldn't afford to reimburse. The letter was filed. Nothing was done.
Thomas Renshaw dies in 1951 in a hospital in Leeds. He is 59 years old. The cause of death is listed as cardiac failure. His wife, Edna, who has lived beside his nightmares for 30 years, is not surprised. She has watched him diminish by increments to the war, knowing something came back that wasn't quite his father. Not knowing why, because Thomas never says, because there are no words he trusts anymore, because the words that exist, bravery, sacrifice, duty, don't fit the thing he carries. So the son never knows about the men buried in the trench at Arras, never knows about the rats, the mud, the men shot at dawn whose names were quietly erased, never knows that his father's pension was assessed twice and reduced once by a ministry doctor who spent 40 minutes with him. The son has children of his own. They grow up knowing even less.
This is how it works. Not through conspiracy of silence, through the simple, exhausted arithmetic of men who survived by not looking directly at what they'd survived. The government relied on it, built policy around it, knew that men like Thomas would carry the weight privately because they'd been carrying it privately for years, and because the alternative, demanding accountability, would have required a language for the experience that no one had given them. You might be sitting with one of their grandchildren right now. You might be one yourself. Thomas never told his story. The government counted on it. Now you know why he couldn't.